Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for our forum on business incentives. What do they mean for entrepreneurship? I'm Jessica Luz, the Director of Knowledge Creation and Research here at the Kauffman Foundation. We have an exciting lineup ahead of us today. We will begin with a panel discussion of what we know about business incentives and regional economies. Panelists will address what business incentives mean for entrepreneurship, for innovation, and for jobs. We will next hear from a panel discussing what works when it comes to entrepreneur-focused economic development. And finally, we will turn to a roundtable discussion of priorities for policy and programs that support entrepreneurs and considerations around business incentives in the post-COVID-19 economy. After each panel and roundtable discussion, we will have a moderated Q&A. I would encourage you to send in your questions through the Q&A function throughout the presentations. And if you haven't done so already, I would encourage you, after today's forum, to check out the issue brief the Kauffman Foundation recently published discussing findings around business incentives and entrepreneurship. I'll drop the link in the chat shortly. A few highlights from the brief that I would like to share with you this morning include the fact that most new jobs are created by entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs tend to start businesses where they live. Homegrown jobs created by businesses already in a state account for almost 80% of new job creation. And generous incentive packages can negatively impact entrepreneurs and small businesses. State incentive programs can neglect small and regional and entrepreneurial businesses, as businesses with more than 100 employees account for just 2% on average of a state's employers, but they receive between 80 to 90% of incentive dollars. And business incentives, like any other type of public spending, reflect the opportunity cost of not spending these funds in another way. Entrepreneurs often rely on local resources, including infrastructure, workers, educational institutions, and public services. What might it look like to invest more in supportive conditions for local businesses, to focus spending on education, transportation, broadband, and R&D that have widespread benefits throughout communities and can boost opportunities for entrepreneurs to emerge, grow, and create new jobs? Today's forum will explore key issues facing entrepreneurs and provide multiple perspectives about how to address these issues. We invite experts in their fields to share their opinions, raise questions, and discuss what they view as the opportunities for action. We host these forums to provide a platform for discussion. The Kauffman Foundation takes no political or legislative position on the discussions. I would like to thank each of our panelists for joining us today. And with that, I will introduce the moderator for our first panel, Sifan Liao from the Brookings Institution.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Kauffman Entrepreneurship Asia Forum. My name is Sifan Liu, Senior Research Analyst at Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. It's a real privilege for me today to be here, a bit virtually, to moderate our first panel on the relationship between business incentives and regional economy. So today we are going to lay out what we know about the impact of business incentives on jobs, innovation, and entrepreneurship, and what needs to continue or to be changed. We're very fortunate to have what I would call all-star panel. Joining with me today is Dr. Tim Bardick, who is a senior economist at Armstrong Institute for Employment Research. Next, we will hear from Dr. Carlianne Patrick, Associate Professor at Georgia State University, and Dr. Jorge Guzman, Assistant Professor at Management Division of Columbia Business School. So what I'm gonna do today is, for the next 20 minutes or so, we will have our three panelists each give a short presentation on their research findings. After which, I'm gonna have a few questions posted to the panel, and then I hope to solicit some questions and comments from the floor. So feel free to submit your question via the chat box throughout the session, and we'll be closely monitoring the questions. Okay, so without further ado, let's welcome our first panelist, Dr. Tim Bardick.
Thanks for inviting me, and I think this is an important discussion, especially given some recent events in Washington. that raise some possibilities that I'll come to in the end. And I just have a few points I want to make about incentives and how they might affect entrepreneurship and how they affect the overall economy. So to start with, it was already mentioned, you can get various estimates, but clearly most business tax incentives in the US go to large firms. So, to the extent to which state and local governments are putting a thumb on the scale, they're putting a thumb on the scale that helps the Amazons of the economy, not the entrepreneurs. On the other hand, I think we need to keep this in perspective that state and local business incentives, the annual cost is around $50 billion. Now, of course, $50 billion is a lot of money from some perspectives. It's not trivial. But, the US economy is 21 trillion. So let's keep this in perspective. I mean, the fact that Amazon gets a lot of incentives for warehouses is not the main reason why Amazon has so much market power. It plays a role, but it's not the main reason. And I would say, actually, my concern about incentives is not so much, well, it's in part that a lot of money is going to the Amazons of the world, but it is also the opportunity cost of the fact that this is what state and local governments adopt as their economic development strategy. And those funds instead could be used for more cost-effective programs, many of which would be of particular help to smaller businesses, including entrepreneurs. So the concern is that this is squeezing out more cost-effective economic development policies. And so, I presented a graph like this before. Business tax incentives are pretty costly per job created. I mean, the reason they're so costly is that in many cases, they don't, you give them out and they don't actually make any difference. So that makes the overall cost per job actually created in a state local economy much higher than people sometimes think. It's almost $400,000 per job created. And a number of programs are more cost effective. So infrastructure, which everyone's talking about in DC these days, less than 97,000. Customized job training that community colleges deliver to businesses, in which, although it's not obviously exclusively of use to smaller businesses, is more useful to smaller businesses than it is to larger businesses. And then programs that provide business advice, such as manufacturing extension services or small business development centers, are also cost effective. Now, I'm not going to present here all the research that backs this up. I have a book on incentives that covers some of the research that you can download for free from the Upton Institute's website. But the intuition behind it is that when you give out $1 in a tax incentive, the maximum value that can have to a firm is $1. If you provide a service that otherwise the business couldn't provide very well on its own, you can get more of an impact than $1. And, for example, business advice can be very cheap to provide, but if it's good advice, can mean a big difference to a business's ability to survive. So you can get a much higher bang for the buck if, rather than trying to help businesses through handing out cash, you instead try to provide services that businesses need. And again, many of those services are particularly needed by smaller businesses, which can't necessarily do as much as this stuff on their own. They don't have the scale. Well, okay, given that, why on earth are states doing incentives? I mean, what's going on? Well, I don't think governors and mayors are stupid. I mean, I think they're doing incentives because the voters like them. I mean, and there's a lot of evidence in this that Nate Jensen and his co-author had a book that looked at this and did public opinion polling. It's very clear that people are much more likely to reelect a governor who is providing large tax incentives to large firms, because the voters' view is like, at least you care. You're trying to do something about jobs. People like that. The Amazon headquarters 2 deal that, went down in flames in New York City, the public opinion polling indicated the majority of the voters, both in the state and in the city, favored the deal at the time it went down. Now, obviously, there was opposition to it, which is part of why it went down. But People like these things. And part of it, I think, is myths about incentives. Part of it, people, when a lot of times economic development agencies claim 100% of incentives create jobs, every incentive, without the incentive, none of these jobs have been created. That's not true. I mean, Carlianne's going to talk about this a little bit, but the percentage of deals that are actually induced by incentives is probably less than 1/4 of them. There's also a myth that these things pay for themselves. You're giving away a lot of tax revenue. You wouldn't have gotten any tax revenue if the business hadn't been there. If you do a more serious analysis, there's some cost offsets, fiscal benefits. It's maybe, 1/5 of the incentive costs. But, even if you really dispelled these myths, and I've been trying to write about this, trying to do this, but I do think there's a political problem. How do you make helping a lot of small businesses as politically salient to voters as helping the big fish? So I get called by a lot of reporters asking me about incentives. I get get phone calls about Amazon all the time. I still get phone calls about Foxconn in Wisconsin. I have never had a reporter call and ask me, tell me about small business development centers. I have never had a reporter call me and ask me, tell me about manufacturing extension services. It's just not, it's harder to sell to people. I mean, creating creating 2 or 3 jobs each, or 5 or 10 jobs each, and hundreds of small businesses is just not as politically sexy as creating, 1,000 jobs or 10,000 jobs, or Amazon was 40,000 jobs at one time in this big fish. And so it's a problem. How do you change the political economy of how voters and the public looks at these things? Now, one alternative is, if you can't, possibly you need to save states for themselves by regulation. And maybe the federal government of the US could actually do what the European Union does. And one of the things to understand is most of what we do in incentives is would be illegal in the European Union. The European Union, and the European Union regulates this actually under the same division that regulates anti-competitive practices, that does antitrust stuff in the European Union. They consider incentives an anti-competitive practice that interferes with the free trade they want between member countries in the EU. And so they have this limit that's stricter for large projects, that limits the amount of incentive. It is much stricter in less economically distressed areas like Berlin and Paris. It's more permissive in areas like Bulgaria or East Germany. Basically, the limits are very tight. I mean, it's about 4,000 per job is what it amounts to in non-distressed areas, and 20,000 a job in distressed areas. And in the US, the average is over 30,000 a job in incentives, and many offers are over 100,000. Amazon headquarters too, there's no way it could have gotten the incentives it got in the European Union. It would not be legal. And it should be noted that the EU does not limit more generally available business services. The EU does not limit things like providing small business help through small business development centers, providing job training help through customized job training programs. As long as they're more generally available to a variety of businesses, they don't consider that an anti-competitive practice. Now, one issue is whether or not this could be done in the US if you tied incentives to federal grants. I'm just going to bring up something that people have discussed. I don't know if this is going to happen or if it's even legally possible, but there are people in the incentives world talking about the fact that the latest stimulus thing, or American Rescue Act, I don't remember the exact name of the 1.9 trillion bill, the thing that just passed, 1.9 trillion, lots of money. It has language that says state and local governments are receiving under this $350 billion. They are not allowed to use this money to cut tax revenue. And there are people out there arguing that if the Biden administration wanted to, they could adopt regulations that said that new costly incentive programs were a violation of this provision of the American Rescue Act. So I think that's an interesting possibility, and I think that's something that should be discussed. Is there a possibility for regulation of incentives that actually we may have already enacted? I mean, it may actually just take a regulatory will on the part of the Biden administration. So I think that should be discussed. So let me just stop there, and if I can figure out how to stop my screen share, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Tim, for a great overview. And help us clear some of the myths around incentives and also the complicated political economy of incentives. We will have to come back to that. But first, let's welcome Dr. Carlianne Patrick for her presentation.
Thank you again for the opportunity to talk about these issues. And as Tim said, this is something I think about a lot, although I've spent more time on the big fish projects and their incentives than on small business. And that's largely because that's where a lot of the incentives are targeted, like Tim was talking about. So we know that this has been growing over time. And there's really sort of mixed evidence on the effectiveness of these projects. So Tim did some work that reviewed all of the existing research and came up with approximately 25% of incentives are tipping the balance in favor of a particular location. More recently, Kaylin Slattery has done a structural model where from the outset, the kind of assumption is that places are better off by landing the company. So this is already putting everybody in sort of a good position. And depending on the assumption she uses in the structural model, it's somewhere between 10 to 50% of the projects are actually being relocated due to the incentives. And so I think at very best case, this suggests that we're actually affecting the location of economic activity about 50% of the time, and more likely it's much less than 25% of the time. So that's going to make these costly, and they seem to be pretty there seems to be pretty mixed evidence on the job creation effects as well. They seem to be pretty minimal when they do exist, even after locating really huge big fish because of some of these crowd out effects. And that has to do with the fact that they often are aimed at stimulating business entry in particular industries, in particular areas, and targeted at these high cost, very large projects. But that causes unintended consequences. So I have some research that shows that when we do capital subsidy, this is decreasing capital subsidies. We're decreasing employment density. It's changing industry mixes and leading to capital labor substitution, which is why you're actually not seeing that much job creation. But there are all these other crowd out effects, upward pressure on wages, input prices, this reshuffling of economic activity, and the fact that there is an opportunity cost if local governments and states have to keep balanced budgets when they forego tax revenue in one location or in one place in the budget that has to be made up from some other place. So there is some evidence more recently on incentives being negatively related to patents and small business establishments. But some recent work that I did with my co-authors, one of whom is going to be in the next panel, tries to answer this research question by looking at the effect of state economic incentives on business entry itself. So we're looking at startups in particular and how these effects differ, if at all, by the type of sector or the industry or how the incentive is targeted. And I'm not going to get into the details. You guys can see the published paper, but what we find is that we have very little impact or very little positive impact on firm entry through the provision of overall business incentives, either in the industry that's receiving the incentives or overall. In fact, our preferred estimates suggest that we actually decrease the total number of startups in a location as the amount of incentives, business incentives in the location increases. And this was particularly true for incentives targeted at export industries and for manufacturing. So these results really suggest that these existing incentives are crowding out new firms, and that the crowding out effect is so large that it offsets any effect that might be positive from the incentives in terms of attracting new firms. So a couple other things the research results revealed is that state and local tax burdens really weren't having a statistical effect once we looked at the incentives themselves separately and then controlled. This makes sense if we think about state and local taxes as paying for public goods that are beneficial to the businesses and to their labor. What was really interesting was that we made a index of intersector job mobility that showed how easily people could move from jobs in one sector to another. And this was positively associated with higher total startups after controlling for incentives and all of these things. And this really suggests that there are some things that we could look at to help support startups in the areas of non-competes, non-disclosure agreements, occupational licensing, and that sort of thing. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to just make an important caveat that we don't account for startup quality. So we could have a situation in which those being crowded out are less productive firms, but it's not clear from the evidence that that's true. But what it does suggest is that we need to really think, and I'm glad we're having this conversation here, about how to shift policies from those that support large firms to those that incentivize new firms, because that's really what we have right now is aimed at these large and medium-sized firms, not small firms, and it's the small firm that's being hurt. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Carlianne. You made an important point that there are other alternatives that could be more effective than the incentives themselves. So let's hear more on that soon. Last but not least, we have Dr. Jorge Guzman, who has studied one specific type of incentives, R&D tax credits, and its impact on a subset of new firms, high-growth startups. So let's welcome Dr. Jorge Guzman.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to the Kauffman Foundation and really to Tim and Carlianne. It was really cool to see your presentations. I think this is really complementary. As Sifan said, this is a study of one type of tax credit and the impact on entrepreneurship directly. And this is some work we did. Just to give you a sense, I know we've talked about a few of these tax credits already, but just to give you a sense about the sentiment, Tim talked a lot about political sentiment and its importance as well in getting regulation done. Here's one quote, right, from the governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, when they passed the R&D tax credit, which is what we're talking about in the next 5 minutes. And he said, these tax credits would allow us to take full advantage of all New Jersey has to offer entrepreneurs and startups, as well as companies, as well as our established innovation-driven companies. We have everything right here at our fingertips to dominate the innovation economy, people, location, and history. We've led this sector before. And through these additional tools, New Jersey will reclaim our national and international prominence for innovation and discovery. And, obviously this is like, grandiose political speak, but it really captures actually the sentiment when one thinks about supporting R&D. Whereas other types of support feels like, well, maybe they sort of benefit just local entrepreneurs, as Carlianne said, or may just benefit sort of other incumbents. If you support R&D, more ideas, more innovation is going to be in your region, and ultimately that should lead to a growth of the ecosystem. That's the argument. It turns out there's not as much evidence on that. Daniel Wilson had some great work on kind of substitution across locations, but really what you see here is that it's a lot about, the conversation about these innovation-driven startups. And so that's what we tried to tackle in this paper. We said, how do state R&D tax credits impact the quantity and quality of entrepreneurship in a region? What happens when you put an R&D tax credit in a region to the total number of firms, but also, Carlianne mentioned this as well, to those high growth firms adjusting for kind of their quality. And so let me give you the takeaway from the first slide. This is our sort of takeaway chart. If you take anything from these 5 minutes, let me describe it for you. So here we have some measure of quality adjusted entrepreneurship. We call it the regional cohort potential index. It's fine. It just means that it's not just the number of firms, but we kind of weigh more the ones that have like patents and the ones that are organized in ways that tend to be like growth oriented, like in Delaware, things like that. And so looking at that as an outcome, and at time zero here is the introduction of a tax credit. We're looking at counties sort of before and after. And the first thing that you see is that there's no change in entrepreneurship before a tax credit. That's pretty obvious, but it's like a useful validation that, we're not tracking some random change, something we call pre-trends, right? The second thing that you see is that there's a lot more entrepreneurship after the tax credit comes into effect. But it's a little bit slow. This is important, right? So first thing, you do see a big effect, but also it takes time, right? You'd see like the mean be different from zero by year 3. And it's only until year 8 that it is statistically significant, which means, more than 95% likely to be true in it, considering a bunch of assumptions. And so even though the tax credit comes in, it's not that there's a bunch of startups ready to jump to kind of take advantage of this tax credit, but that actually it takes with a ton of ideas just ready to get going, it seems to take a little bit of time. In this case, on average, 8 years. Ultimately, the increase appears pretty big, 20% higher entrepreneurship, and it seems to remain stable at least up to the 15-year mark, which is what we're able to see in this data. So I think it's at least it sets the stage to how to think about R&D tax credits. I can tell you a little bit more details about how we did this, but let me breeze through this and jump to the last part. We use this data from the Startup Cartography Project, etc. Here's the states that we looked at the introduction. You can see the blue states are the ones that introduced tax credits. This comes from Tim's data on the panel study for incentives. Here's on the quantity of companies. We also see a big increase, but if you try to compare these two, it's in fact a little bit higher in the quantity. Let me give you 3 takeaways we did that are complementary to this that I think are also illuminate the conversation more. The first one is we used a separate tax incentive that we saw in this data set called investment tax credits, right? This is not R&D. This is just to help you do investments. They're usually not intended for startups. They're intended for large companies. And here's their impact on overall entrepreneurship, basically 0. If anything, after 15 years, we also observe, what looks like a crowd out effect, right? It seems like, there's a bit of an entrepreneurship drop over time. And we don't want to kind of overread into that, especially on the quality adjusted, right? Really at this high end, rather than the total number of firms and the local firms. And so it does seem like, I think that's the theme of this conversation. R&D, total tax incentives are nuanced and different. And we are seeing that in this data, definitely who they target matters in terms of the local entrepreneurial ecosystem. Second, we looked a little bit at the design, right? We looked at 3 things that are common in tax credits. One, whether it's incremental, that means that, does it apply immediately, sort of when you spend the money, or after a certain tax liability? Second, whether it's a refund, right? Many startups are not making income when they're starting out, if they're innovative, etc. And so if a tax refund is not included, they may not be able to use this credit. And third, whether there's a tax liability floor. And this is sort of just really simple correlations, but what we find here on the right-hand side is that it appears to be that non-incremental piece to have the biggest bang for the buck. But though all of the coefficients are positive, it seems to be higher for the non-incremental, but they all seem to kind of, if somebody asks me what works, it seems that these 3 things do have a positive benefit in overall overall performance. So that's, and then finally, who benefits, right? We did a little bit of a regional analysis. And, you know, we merged with the Census County business patterns and looked at the local relationships. And we found, you know, this is about the size distribution. We found the benefits are about, you know, counties with a small amount of population. It's not these huge successful counties. And this is about the wage distribution. It's also kind of the counties at the lower end. So what we found is that the tax credits are not making a huge difference when they come to New York City, when they go to Palo Alto, but it's actually more the kind of counties and places that are more kind of in the middle, right? That are not at the huge top end. That's where we're seeing a little bit more innovation, a little bit more entrepreneurship, and it seems to be leading to a boosting of the ecosystem, particularly for those ones, rather than those that have a totally booming entrepreneurial ecosystem already. So that's all I had. You know, I can summarize the conclusions here. You know, the average differences, statistical significance, etc. Here's a chart I hope you take away from my presentation here. And you know, our evidence supports the use of R&D tax credits as state policy, but I do emphasize patience actually to see the impact in the local ecosystem. I know 8 years, you know, in terms of political goodwill, it seems like a long time. It's longer than any election. So, you know, that type of thing may take a while to show up. But ultimately, you know, we do hope New Jersey saw a boost in overall R&D performance. Thank you so much. I hope I did well on time.
Thank you, Jorge, and Tim and Carlianne. That was truly fascinating and terrific. I see that our panelists are already answering some of the questions in the Q&A box. So if our audience, if you want to continue typing your questions there, we will keep channeling them here. All right, so we now have about 20 minutes left for discussion and questions. So I will start with my first question to all three of you. So we just learned from Tim that, you know, most business incentives do not pay for themselves and they're not usually cost effective. And Carlianne shows that incentives can be negative for business formation. But Jorge provided a sort of positive story that a hyper-targeted incentive programs like the R&D tax credits for high-growth startups do have a significant positive effect. So what does that tell us? Does that mean, you know, business incentives could still work as long as they are carefully designed? And if so, like, what are some of the considerations that might be helpful in terms of targeting and prioritizing?
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, I think you can definitely reconcile what Jorge said with what Carlianne and I said. I mean, R&D tax credits are not the major incentive. States do a little bit in this. There's a lot of lip service to doing R&D. When you actually look at it, the big money at the state level is in various types of job creation tax credits, where typically the firm is allowed to keep the income tax withholdings from the workers for a period of up to 15 years. That's pretty expensive. The second leading incentives is property tax abatements, which are generally financed at the local level, though the state may reimburse some of the money, for example, through school aid funding formulas. So that's where the big money is. R&D is small. So, you know, and I think, and, you know, I've always, of course, everyone, I guess, views their own views as nuanced. So I think my views are incredibly nuanced. And in particular, my view on incentives is, yeah, sure, they can pay off. If you offer incentives that are highly targeted at high multiplier businesses in distressed communities, even if they're pretty expensive, the benefits can exceed the cost. And I've done some benefit cost analysis. I mean, more jobs is incredibly valuable. I mean, voters are not stupid in valuing governors who do something about jobs, because more jobs are valuable. But, you know, we need to look at whether or not some of what we're doing is wasteful. So my view is a lot of what states are currently doing is wasteful. But if we had much more targeted incentives, that would make sense. And I think R&D credits are worth considering. I mean, you know, what is the U.S. going to be competitive in the future? Obviously, the U.S. is not going to be competitive in low-wage manufacturing. That's not, that's not really the future, so R&D related industries is certainly an area we should consider, and we should consider how to develop additional R&D centers. I mean, if you're not going to mention it, I mean, Brookings Metro Policy has been pushing, proposals to go beyond Silicon Valley to create additional regional high-tech centers, and so have some folks at MIT. Jonathan Gruber and Simon Johnson have a whole book. What was it called? Startup America or Jumpstarting America, something like that. But I think we need to look beyond putting all our eggs in the Silicon Valley basket and develop some more regional high-tech centers, and maybe R&D tax credits be part of that. Although obviously, I don't think, and I'm sure Jorge would agree that if you were trying to create a regional high-tech center, and the only thing you did was R&D credits, that would be a pretty sparse and not probably the best policy.
Right, an increase of 20% of zero is still like zero or something like that.
Well, and you have to deal with the underlying workforce development issues. I mean, I think incentives as part of an overall targeted package can be useful, but you do have these sort of underlying workforce issues that, in terms of firms' bottom line, labor costs are a huge portion of that relative to the incentive or the R&D tax credit, typically a much bigger portion. And so if you want to think about quality workforce and those sorts of things as part of a package that includes R&D, then I think you could get into something that was useful in attracting or helping startups. But I think, our results are consistent in that we're looking at overall, we find overall levels of incentives, which include things like the job tax credits and the property tax, which have high opportunity costs. And we find that is particularly true for things like manufacturing and export related. I mean, just like we could say that low wage manufacturing isn't the future, we could also say that low wage warehousing jobs aren't the future necessarily either. And we need to look at how many of those are being incentivized. But I do think, to follow up on Tim's point, that there is a way to target. We just aren't doing that right now, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's not salient to the voter. And there's some recent work both by Caitlin Slattery and then someone at Iowa State, Professor Kim, who are actually quantifying the gubernatorial electoral votes associated with landing one of these big fish. And it's just not as salient, and therefore not what people are doing. There's also, from a local government perspective and from a state government perspective, inherently more risky to bet on a startup than it is to bet on a big fish. And one way we could think about packages is packaging startups together so that you're sort of pooling risks. So when you're incentivizing, not picking one startup winner over another, but thinking of it more in terms of a portfolio of startups where there's an expectations of some winners and some losers in there. But that's hard for politicians to sell when you've ultimately incentivized somebody who loses, right? So, but that's the nature of startup.
Right. So so we have one question on non-compete agreements and non-disclosure agreements. So I think that's a follow-up to Carlianne. I guess just as a follow-up question, what are some of the alternatives to incentive that might work when it comes to entrepreneurship?
Well, I'll start, and then I know Tim and Jorge have some ideas on alternatives too. So the question in the chat box was just have local governments not enforce these agreements. And I don't know that that's really a viable option, but if you look across states, there's variation in state laws regarding those non-compete and non-disclosure agreements. And you could also even think about it as from a federal perspective. More broadly, because I sort of looked at occupational licensing in there as well, anything that prohibits the flow of workers from job to job, where their skills might be valuable, is a friction to that metric that we came up with, which was the intersectoral job mobility metric. And so I think what our results suggest is it's anything that might look at making it harder for workers to move into a startup from another company, for example, would have a negative effect, and things that make it easier are going to have a positive effect on startups, where they can get higher skilled workers and that sort of thing. But I think we need a lot more research to know exactly what the relative effects of those are. And there are a few people doing work on non-disclosures and non-competes specifically, particularly because the California laws are different than other places. But I still think there's work that needs to be done there. And then as far as alternatives, I've already mentioned some of the things that I think are important alternatives. So I think I'll turn it over to Tim and Jorge and come back around if they don't mention something I think is important.
Well, I'll just focus on alternatives. I think I already mentioned them. In other words, everyone uses the word ecosystem, but, I agree with that. You need to create an ecosystem that supports small business development. And obviously that has a number of dimensions. It has to do with the availability of labor, land, information, and capital. And all those things are things you can affect. I mean, labor, what's the quality of your community college programs? Do you have apprenticeship programs? Do you have programs that work closely with business on designing training that fits their needs? Can they get the workers they need? Is there adequate transportation and childcare and other support services in the community so that the workers, so you don't have high turnover in workers? So that affects things for smaller businesses. For whom turnover can be very expensive. And then you have the whole question of land and building availability, which you can address through things like incubators, research parks, business parks, things like that. And then, of course, beyond that, I've mentioned this whole idea of business advice. Obviously, no one's claiming that bad business advice is helpful, but if a small business development center or a manufacturing extension office provides good advice, it can be very effective. So, and then capital is the trickiest area to deal with because people love handing out money or love it when you hand out money. But I think there are things you can sometimes do with capital, making capital more available that can be effective. But it's a tricky area for government to get into, particularly because government officials don't making loans that have a loss. And the reality is, if you're dealing with market failures in capital markets, it's impossible to do that without sometimes making loans that go sour.
So I think that's great. Just to add on that, for example, the one thing, Tim mentioned capital. One thing we know is, for example, angel tax credits have not shown any increase in entrepreneurship. And so it doesn't seem like everything you can do to support angel investor tax credits, right? So these are, if people invest in startups, then they get like a tax credit. Those have not increased entrepreneurship. And so it doesn't seem like just anything for startups would also be a good idea. But rather, I think, I'm very enthusiastic about R&D tax credits, but to put it in perspective, right? Imagine I told you, and the benefit of that is it creates a pool, right, for jobs that complements this training, et cetera. But there's two things I didn't show you because, that we don't know. First, there's a lot that these are companies being founded, not companies growing eventually, right? And so we don't know if they have the ecosystem to grow. We don't know if they stay, right? For, in other work, I've shown that some places, companies do move across when they're startups, and some of that can be a challenge. The second thing is if I told you today, well, we're going to grab all entrepreneurship in, Pittsburgh, and it's going to be 20% higher by 2030. It doesn't sound that exciting, right? It doesn't seem like that's going to solve everything. And so it's clear to show that. Can I tackle, just because we've been talking a lot about targeting, and Hamid Sharasi asked, how do you separate lifestyle business owners from growth-oriented entrepreneurs? And I was typing a question, but I can say it loudly. There's actually, a series of signals that allow targeting. And what you're thinking about is things that are cheap for the growth-oriented company to do, or would do anyways, but very expensive for the local companies. The most obvious one is getting a patent, right? If you are really innovative, maybe you're patenting already. Whereas if you're a local company, it would be very difficult, even if you wanted to have a patent. And so, for example, targeting companies that have a patent could be effective. A less, pretty obvious one as well, but can lead to more gaming, is registering in Delaware, right? Many growth-oriented companies register in Delaware instead of the local jurisdiction. And that is expensive for the local startups, but if there were big tax benefits, they might be able to so that could lead to some gaming, and you would have to play with that. But ideas like that can be useful for targeting something that would be expensive for one group, but kind of pretty natural for the other.
Great. Carlianne, is there anything missing from the discussion?
Well, so I think this goes along with some of what's been going, some of the discussion in the Q&A, as well as what Jorge said. There's this discussion of targeting, and should we think about different small businesses differently? And I think that it depends on, and different startups differently. I think it depends on what the ultimate goal of the startup policy is, because I think we might want to think differently about non-tradable entrepreneurs who are finding market niches in their locations that, should they survive, will likely be there a long time, and reinvesting, as opposed to high growth sorts of entrepreneurs who will be patenting, likely moving operations, as they grow. I think part of it is a community decision about what is the type of growth. Do we want both? And then I think I would also, even from a federal level, and I've said this in other contexts, we need to think probably differently at the federal level about different sizes of small business. So the SBA's definition of a small business is 500. When we think startup or small business, I doubt an employer of 500 is what comes to mind, right? And so, and it turns out that employers of 500 are much better at navigating the federal system for assistance than a startup is. Surprise, right? So perhaps we need to think a little bit, not just about targeting between sort of non-tradable, niche local market oriented entrepreneurs and high growth entrepreneurs, but also about the difference between a small business and startup that's on the low end of the employment distribution versus what I think argue is more of a medium sized business on the higher end of the federal definition.
Let me just jump in and say, so I completely agree. We need to distinguish between the goals of different economic development policy. In other words, you're handing out large amounts of cash, and your goal is to increase the overall jobs in the local labor market. You want to focus on export-based businesses. And some of them will be small businesses, but a lot of small businesses will not be export-based. They will not be selling their goods and services outside the state and local area. On the other hand, suppose you're trying to create a more interesting and diverse restaurant sector in your local economy that includes more minority and women-owned businesses, includes more businesses in neighborhoods in which you're trying to encourage redevelopment. Well, in that case, I don't think handing out cash is the way to do it, per se. I mean, because it is true that when one restaurant starts up, that puts some downward pressure on the sales of other restaurants in the area. But if you provide services to help people start up their restaurant and expand their restaurant and help their restaurant survive, hopefully what you're doing is increasing the overall productivity of the restaurant sector in your community. And obviously, you know, that's an amenity for the community. I mean, Kalamazoo, I mean, I want interesting restaurants in Kalamazoo. I know Carlianne wants interesting restaurants in Atlanta. And I might even know something about that. But the, you know, and that's a different goal for economic development policy than simply increasing the number of jobs in the Atlanta metro area or the Kalamazoo metro area.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left, but I saw a question from the audience that I also wanted to ask. So very quickly, so Tim, you've talked about, you know, the political economy around incentives and why it is so hard to reform. I'm just wondering if, you know, any of you know a good local example that have successfully reformed their incentive programs, or, you know, just anything that they did right.
Well, in terms of the local, see, most of the state incentive dollars are state dollars.
Right.
So I think you need to start with that in fact, locals play a role, but the state is providing the big cash. And yeah, there's been reforms. There are states that have cut back on incentives. I mean, both New York and Michigan are still high incentive states, but they're not as high incentive states as they once were, because some of the incentives really got out of hand and they were cut back. And I've been looking recently, for example, North Carolina used to provide much more extensive incentives than it does now. I mean, I think one thing that North Carolina did is they shifted a lot of their incentives from being tax expenditures, that is tax credits, in many cases refundable tax credits, to being part of the budget. And the incentives that remain were grants. And the reality is, the way government budgeting works, it is far easier to restrain programs that are handed out through the appropriations process than ones that are handed out through tax breaks. And so I think one strategy is, overall, to the extent to which we can move economic development programs to the expenditure side of the budget and away from the tax side of the budget, you're going to be able to control them more.
So no, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on that because I've been discussing the incentive structure for startups with some groups recently, and Tim's point about moving it from the expenditure side to the tax expenditure side to an appropriations type mechanism is important, particularly for small business and startups, because they typically don't have tax liability. So I think that's, I just wanted to emphasize the point that if you're thinking about small businesses, and we've seen a number of places do this, that moving things away from areas where it's tax credits and rebates and deductions and that sort of thing is going to be most helpful to them in the years when they're not making any money and don't have tax liability.
Just to add, in terms of Sifan, you were thinking about, you were asking for examples. I had the pleasure of working with the Kentucky RISE program, Regional Innovations for Startups and Entrepreneurship, I think. And I was just nothing but impressed. And, you know, they were really focused. Kentucky's a complex city because you have like this Cleveland suburbs, you have also like complex state. Cleveland suburbs, Appalachia, Lexington, very different socioeconomic needs, as we're saying. And they were just thinking about how to target that and target entrepreneurship and innovation to mean what it should mean in different places and get them to succeed. And they've done an outstanding job, I think, Allison Davids and Brian Medford. And so for anybody in the audience, if you know, I think they're going to succeed. They're still kind of in the first few years, and these, we do expect these to take a while. But I think it's a great resource, and definitely, you know, someplace that I think is actually doing it. I'd be presumptuous to say I know the right way, but it feels like that when I see them working at it.
Sure. Thank you. That was a great discussion. Thank you, Tim, Carlianne, and Jorge for sharing your thoughts and knowledge with us. I see many great questions in the chat box that we didn't get to answer, but unfortunately we are at our time. Let me now turn it over to Ms. Ihsan Beezer, a PhD student at Rutgers Business School, to moderate our second panel of today. What works for entrepreneur-led economic development? The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really excited for this conversation, and will now introduce our three wonderful panelists. All right, so first we have Ms. Zekita Armstrong Asuquo. She's president of Gateway Global. We also have Dr. Ellen Harpel. She's the founder of Smart Incentives, and Dr. Alexandra Tsvetkova, coordinator of Spatial Productivity Lab, hosted by the OECD Trento Center for Local Development, and it's also within the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities. So we'll follow the same format as the first panel. So we could first start with up to 7 minutes of opening remarks, and we'll start in the order in which I introduced everyone.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. So everyone, again, my name is Zekita Armstrong Asuquo. I'm the president and chair of Gateway Global American Youth and the president of Gateway Global Data Logistics. My presentation will be focused primarily on workforce development and some ways that we can work together, we should work together in order to incentivize not only younger workers, but also businesses so that we can build robust pipelines. So Gateway Global American Youth and Business Alliance, we recruit high school students, mostly juniors and seniors, high school graduates, and some college graduates as well. Also working with what is called out-of-school youth with Department of Higher Ed and Workforce Development. We operate a program called Entry to Executive. We train, credential, and offer apprenticeship programs as well, registered with USDOL. All of our apprenticeship programs are STEM focused, and while we focus a lot on the technical pieces, we marry a lot of the social science with the hard science in order to keep students interested, quite honestly. So we're focused on big picture career pathways like foreign policy, global trade, environment defense, homeland security, disaster relief, and even now outer space, which is super exciting. And again, as I mentioned, we facilitate a Department of Labor registered apprenticeship. So we have partners across the spectrum. So as you can see at the bottom here, St. Louis University, which besides the University of Missouri, Columbia has the only other accredited geospatial institute in the state of Missouri, United States Geospatial Intelligence Foundation, and of course, a host of other school districts and programs across the state, organizations across the state. So we have found a problem with regard to again, workforce and how we can build robust pipelines. And that is primarily challenges of US education system in a rapidly changing global marketplace. There's a disconnect we found between academia, secondary ed, economic development, and of course, workforce development. There are limited alternatives for young people to immediately attending 2-year or 4-year college or university that for poor minorities and poor whites. And that includes women across the spectrum. There's a lack of diversity in talent pipelines, which I'm sure everyone here knows already. And then, of course, outdated and non-innovative strategies for selecting talent, basically relying on old systems to tackle new problems. There's a lack of focus on cultivating a workforce starting in K through 12. And in the US, which this is something that's really important, there's a stigma associated with apprenticeships, and they're seen as something that should be related to what we call labor-intensive jobs rather than what is called like more white-collar jobs that we see across Europe, where a young person can come in as an apprentice, basically, as this program is named, from the entry level and end up as an executive. And then emphasis primarily on coding. You'll see the data here later that we sampled from students and parents. Emphasis on coding when we talk about STEM and building pipelines, which has been a turnoff for a lot of young people. A lot of them have said they're very interested in STEM, but don't want to sit and code all day. And then, of course, using 20th century programming and methodology for 21st century issues. So what we found is that apprenticeships are an attractive model. Students in targeted demographics value immediate income equally to higher education. That's if they're thinking about higher education. Most of the demographic, as I've already said, would be excited about STEM if they understood more about it. They'd eventually complete college degrees if they could get skilled and go to work first. Parents are also interested in and excited about apprenticeships in STEM for their students, and that includes parents who didn't finish high school or only have a high school diploma. And more than half of the students that participated in our surveys said that they'd be interested in STEM-based apprenticeship programs for work. So here's some of the data that we collected. This is primarily from across the St. Louis Opportunity Zone and Promise Zone, which has a lot of overlap in our region. We also subsequently surveyed some rural communities that we train in as well, and the data was very similar. So if you can see here, I won't go through all of the tiny little details, but it's just basically reiterating everything that I just said. You can see on the left side here that from the students 9th through 12th grade, more than 50% in all cases have an interest in STEM, an interest in apprenticeships. Work is a priority, and they want to find ways to get involved in the workforce so that they can have more lucrative career pathways and eventually more role responsibility. And then on the right side, as you can see with parents in particular, those numbers are very high. Parents, again, even those who have not obtained a 2 or 4 year degree are thinking a lot about how to get their young people into programs or on academic pathways or career pathways for high earning potential. So even though they're not involved in it, they're thinking about it quite a bit. And then I want to point out something really important, especially related to not only the St. Louis region, but the state of Missouri in particular. We have the western part of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which is building a $1.7 billion federal complex in St. Louis. They've always been in St. Louis, but they decided to stay rather than go into another state, into Illinois in particular. And so because of that, there's a lot of activity. We have an industry cluster that is developing very rapidly, and there's a lot of conversation and thought around how do we fill pipelines, not just with the federal agency, but most importantly, industry, because of all of those supporting prime and subcontractors that work with NGA and its partners. Here, I'd like to point out, this is a slide that we also show young people just to get them interested. Again, this is more about big picture. These are areas where the United States will fall behind globally without innovative workforce and education solutions. This list is compiled from general research that we did from World Trade Organization and then CFR, Council of Foreign Relations. So sustainable energy solutions, as you can see, and of course, if you've been watching the news, and even with the not just recent news, but the previous administration with our creation of Space Force, I always tell people, you know, Space Force didn't just, that's not something that they just pulled out of their hat. You know, we actually have issues with competition in outer space, and it's important that we catch up, to be quite honest. So outer space, global soft power, as I'm sure many people on this call know, advanced fatal weaponry, actually it should say advanced lethal weaponry, 5G, artificial intelligence, robotics, GeoInt, and then of course, high-speed rail and other sustainable transportation. These are all critical issues for the future, especially when we look at things like what is known as the fourth industrial revolution. Some people say it's coming, some people say we're already in it. Either way, it's really important that we get creative really quickly about how we fill pipelines using young latent talent that is not only diverse racially but geographically, so that we can fill the pipelines and get them in jobs. So the solution that we came up with in Gateway Global from a programmatic standpoint is, again, our program is called Entry to Executive. It's a STEM-based training and apprenticeship model. Our methodology that we use is called Import, Develop, Export, whereby we have a full recruitment cycle beginning again in high school. And it starts with not just training, but also offering industry recognized credentials so that the young people who are going to follow a non-traditional path as far as their post-secondary planning is concerned will already have credentials and potentially be able to go to work so that they can support themselves and then figure out a career pathway after that. But so again, recruitment, then facilitation of skills. We assist with the certification prep. And then we support them up until age 24. Actually, now we're looking at how we can support them beyond age 24, because we get young people who are older than 24 that come to us with interest because they haven't figured it out yet. And then, of course, on the export end, you see apprenticeship completed. But I would add there, not just apprenticeship, but any entry level that we have with some of our corporate partners now, and ones that we're working on forming partnerships with in the near future.
Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation and look forward to hearing more about that too. Okay. I am not going to share my slide deck. I don't have one prepared. So I just wanted to talk with you about our findings from some recent research that we've done. Our organization, just to give you a little bit more information about us, we work with state and local economic development organizations primarily in the US, but not only in the US. And our mission is to help them make sound decisions throughout the incentives process and manage their incentive programs in an effective and responsible manner. And we believe very strongly that transparency and accountability is just a critical part of effective incentive use. So just to give you a little bit more information about who we are. Now, last year, we completed some research on US, state, and local, and as panel one described, it's primarily state, but we also looked a little bit at local, about their incentives designed for entrepreneurial firms. And I'm going to share some of the findings from our work and talk about what it means for policymakers, again, especially at the US, state, and local level. And I'll start by giving just some kind of basic parameters about what these programs look like, what we learned about their shape and size and scope, and then some of the findings about, to the extent the research allows us to describe this, what works. And so, as panel one also discussed, of course, most incentives are not designed for entrepreneurial firms at all. Economic development organizations are often measured by jobs and investment created. So it behooves them to focus their programs and their work on the efforts that boost those numbers, because that's how they're being evaluated. That's what they're expected to do. That said, entrepreneurial support is now a solid, expected, and a very common part of economic development work today. And there are, of course, incentive and associated financing programs designed for entrepreneurial firms in states. And we learned a lot about these programs. And like I said, we're happy to share some of those findings with you today. So a couple of the big picture findings: entrepreneurship is not at all well defined in these policies. They probably do not define entrepreneurship the way an economist would or an academic researcher would. They probably don't define it consistently across their own programs. It's certainly not defined consistently across states. So when you're looking at entrepreneurship incentives, it can mean very different things across different states and programs. Even similarly named programs can in fact have very different targets and design and implementation mechanisms. The two big categories that we've already discussed are the innovation-oriented entrepreneurs that tend to have the technology focus, or general small business entrepreneurship. Now, in a lot of economic development groups for a long time, they didn't even really consider small business in the same category of entrepreneurs. They were really focused on those tech-oriented entrepreneurs. But most states do have both. And I think there's been a real blurring of that topic or those definitions. They care about both now is really the main point. But one of the things that's interesting for us, and I think from the research perspective, is those definitions hardly ever incorporate age of the firm. So when we think of entrepreneurship, we often think of new firm entry. And it was a small minority of programs that actually included age of the firm anywhere in their definitions. Even among those that did, it might be I think the one that had the highest age range was up to 15 years old. So it's important to take a look at what all these different programs are trying to accomplish and the types of businesses that they're really trying to help. But more or less, we can say it's not really about firm entry or helping new firms per se. Again, consistent with the economic development mission, it's mostly about helping firms or businesses with perceived growth potential, especially job growth potential. Another thing that we learned when we dived into some of the details of the programs is that most of these incentives serve a very small number of companies per year with pretty small amounts of money, meaning that when we're trying to look at outcomes, even firm level outcomes and certainly community level outcomes associated with the incentive use are necessarily very limited because of the small amounts of money and the small numbers of companies involved. And I think that's important to mention here because that might not be in keeping with policymaker expectations. That quote from Governor Murphy was great. I mean, that's the expectation for a lot of these programs from when you hear when they're rolled out and announced at the outset. And yet, when you look at the programs themselves, we looked at debt and equity programs, for example. The loan amounts to individual businesses were maybe 30 to 50,000 on average, very small amounts of money per business. And they were only helping handfuls, literally 3 to 15 was like the rough range that we identified, companies per year. You can't transform your economy at that level. And even the more active programs in the bigger states were helping dozens, not usually hundreds or even thousands of companies. It's true with equity programs too. The dollar amounts are bigger. They tend to be, a lot of the programs might make equity investments up to say $1 million or even higher. Some are much smaller, of course, depending on the state. But again, the number of programs helped per year would be, handfuls, maybe dozens in a bigger state. The total number of portfolio companies, so companies that had been actively invested in, clustered only around 25 to 30 in several of the state programs that we looked at. These are not huge programs. They simply don't have the potential to be transformational. And I think that's just, again, something we need to be aware of when thinking about what works and policymaker expectations for these programs. Now, I thought it was a really interesting OECD program that Alexandra hosted, and I know Sammy Desai participated in it. One of the panelists made a really great comment about the how being as important as the how much in generating program or policy impacts. Now, the how much certainly is a relevant factor, but we found the same thing, that program design and implementation play a really big role in figuring out what works. And so I'll talk a little bit about both design and implementation. So on the design front, the data on outcomes associated with individual entrepreneurship incentive programs at the state level are not great. And then the research trying to look at the program's effects, their methods and definitions are all over the place. So it's really hard to draw super strict conclusions about this. But we can say generally, it looks like grants and loans and services appear to generate positive firm level effects. But again, the programs are usually so small that they couldn't generate measurable community level effects, but they do appear to work well as programs for their intended targets. Now, tax incentives appear to be less effective. As many of the panelists said on panel one, a lot of the firms that you think that these programs are trying to help wouldn't have a tax liability. So a tax credit or a tax program isn't the best mechanism to provide assistance to them. In response to that, a lot of places have developed refundable tax credits, but those are problematic too. They tend to have pretty high transaction costs that really diminish the value to the intended recipient, while somebody gets a full amount of the tax break, the transaction cost might diminish the value that's going to the expected recipient, the entrepreneurial firm, by 10, 15, 20%. That's not what the policymakers intend. And so I don't think that the tax incentives, for a lot of reasons, tend to be the best mechanism through which to assist entrepreneurial firms. A second thing, again, is on implementation. So really thinking about how the program works in the real world, not just how it's designed, but how it's implemented. And this is overlooked in a lot of incentive programs. Again, we tend to look at design and spending, but we don't look at how it works in practice. But this makes a huge difference in a program's success. And especially for entrepreneurial firms, we found that program eligibility rules often excluded many, many types of entrepreneurial firms, maybe because they were trying to focus on traded sector firms or technology specific areas or specific, target sectors. But it meant that the pool of potential recipients was pretty small, and it excluded many, many, many entrepreneurial firms in a particular state. Similarly with job and investment requirements, these kind of hurdles that the majority of small businesses and new businesses would never be able to meet, therefore they can't participate. We also saw a lot of really onerous application requirements for tiny amounts of money, really, that can deter participation. So we recommend that agencies review their eligibility rules, their application procedures, their review and underwriting processes, and their reporting requirements to streamline their programs and make them appropriate for the target groups that they're intending to serve with these programs. Because again, our research shows that again and again, it's these details rather than program design or intent that are the biggest roadblocks to hindering participation and generating effective outcomes. I think I'll stop there, and I can talk a lot more and answer more questions about our research and what we found on these incentive programs. So thank you for listening, and thanks for the invitation to be here today.
Yes, wonderful. Now another great opening remarks. Thank you. So next will be Dr. Tsvetkova.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. What I wanted to do today is to step a little bit back maybe and offer more general discussion of what we see in terms of incentives and regional economic development. I lead Spatial Productivity Lab. We are based in Trento, Italy, but we are part of the OECD, and we are part of the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities. And apparently, entrepreneurship is at the heart of what we do. A lot of programs devoted to this. We look at scale up of SMEs. We look at missing entrepreneurs, et cetera, and we can discuss more in the discussion part. So, but I would like to start first from the non-spatial perspective. So what's going on? And there are huge changes at the sectoral level and globally, what's going on in the business community and competition. So competition becomes different. We have globalized world, we have digitized companies, digitized businesses, we have platform economies, we have global leaders that compete against everybody else and against the startups. So what it means on the other side, when the startup comes to the business, it means that there is a good chance a new company has to compete against a world leader. And there is also, in a sense, these leaders really spread across sectors, especially if we talk about digital stuff. Let's say Amazon is competing across sectors. So the new businesses are relatively weak because they're new. They have to often compete against global leaders. And this really changes the whole nature of competition. And it might be one of the reasons why we have increasing inequalities, we have decreasing business dynamism, but we also see less entrepreneurial activities. What does it mean for regional entrepreneurship? Is that the incentives that are given to startups and to the entrepreneurs might not be as effective anymore just because they are not strong enough to allow new companies to compete against global leaders. So if we go into incentives, and especially the ones given at the regional level, ideally incentives have to cut really high hurdle for them to be like really efficient and well developed and placed. First, incentives have to really cause desirable changes. And it is really hard to sometimes figure it out in the data. They have to create additional value as opposed to, crowding out existing activities. And then the costs of the policy need to be smaller than the created benefits. And actually in practice, these three ideal conditions are not really met. Now, if we go into the empirical evidence that was so nicely described in the first session, if we look at the firms, usually we do have positive effects because if company or if in potential entrepreneur would like to start a business and he or she receives support, there is a good chance that this company will be started. But then again, we kind of come back to the competition regime, and we are looking now in the likelihood of survival for this company. And this is not necessarily, the prospect is really good. Then the costs of the policy, in quite a few studies that I saw, the costs of the policies are higher than the generated benefits. Then we go into regional or aggregate evidence, and here we have really mixed effects. We can see crowding out, like we see in the paper presented before, or we have heterogeneous effects where actually for some industries, incentives increase entrepreneurial activity or job creation, and for some industries, it actually doesn't do it. But so the question becomes how important and how to devise the incentives. One bright side to the incentives, I think, silver lining to what we discussed in this meeting before with all the mixed results and not really seeing clear cut benefits. The incentives also serve the purpose of signaling of the importance of the entrepreneurship. But can we do it better? If it is just to develop the entrepreneurial culture, should we look and help younger people, like again was presented in the previous presentations? Or should we reshuffle our support and support more smaller companies? Again, it's not as fancy. These companies tend to be less productive, they are weaker, but we have more such companies. So if these companies benefit from let's say small scale, if enough companies benefit, the aggregate results will be really good. We can maybe decrease the complexity of the support schemes, and it was already mentioned. Maybe there is more streamlined, because very often companies that are strong enough to navigate this complex environment are able to get extra help, and companies that might be successful but do not have resources to understand or to comply with all the filing requirements, they do not really benefit from the incentives. Now, if we go into what works, what we see over and over in our work at the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities is that policies need to be targeted, and often they need to be place-based so they can capitalize and really try to make use of the existing assets across different types of regions. But if we look at smaller companies, at SMEs, there are different ways how we can group the firms to better target the policy support. So if we look at SMEs and tradable sectors, policies can help with access to external markets. It can be support for the research and development or support for innovation and digitalization. It can be integration into global value chains or some regional policies such as infrastructure, including digital. It can be skill training, maybe cluster policies. But again, in many cases, what works really links to the support offered to the companies. And then there is separate issue of kind of understanding which support is needed and also signaling to the companies what is available. What we see actually on the ground in many cases is that companies are not really aware of what is there, or they cannot articulate their needs in a sufficient way to seek specific support that helps them. And then if we look at SMEs and non-tradable sectors, then we can talk about urban policies to promote agglomeration economies, or we can talk about regulatory simplification. And again, all this also differs along the urban-rural continuum. So policies for the urban or thriving areas would be different from rural areas. So this kind of introduces really a lot of heterogeneity, but what also kind of comes across all these conversations and research and projects that we have there are several kind of cross-cutting things. The first one is talent or human resources or the people actually in a place. So it can be skills. It is important, but very often, especially in smaller places, it is the matter of having local champions, people or companies that can lead the change in their community, and it's extremely important. Now, as we go through the COVID pandemics and the teleworking becoming more really prevalent. I think it also opens quite a few new opportunities for places that are remote but rich in amenities to target their incentives to attract teleworkers or digital nomads, and this might increase the talent pool and improve the entrepreneurial culture and growth prospects of quite a few places. Another thing is the connecting places, but also connecting companies as is done within the ecosystems approach. But I want to give an example of connecting places policy. One of such policies is Carolina Textile District in the state of North Carolina, where quite a few textile manufacturing facilities are idle because of the outsourcing to China and other countries. So what happened there, there is a cooperative which links urban designers who develop their designs but do not know how to really put it into production. The cooperative connects this creative class in the cities to rural communities where there is idle production facilities for textile or textile factories. So it's very nice example of how linking places and how actually rural areas can help urban areas to do better and produce something valuable to customers. Another example comes from Sweden, where there is a program which links entrepreneurs from regions outside of Stockholm with the Stockholm entrepreneurial ecosystem. So it's a program where the entrepreneurs are brought to Stockholm. They participate in workshop, different networking events, but then after the program is over, they go back being already integrated into financing circles and entrepreneurial circles, but they keep the communication open. So this allows this exchange of experiences and benefiting from actually relatively remote from these places ecosystem which is located in the capital. And the last thing that I would like to highlight here, and Ellen is already did it, actually, it is what versus how, in a sense that it is one thing to understand what works and what policies are needed for specific places or for specific groups of companies, but then how it is implemented also matters. And again, empirical research really shows that there can be a massive difference between the results. One of the papers that investigates the different results of new market tax credits and community development financial institution in California shows that the former actually has positive effects, but the latter doesn't. And one of the reasons why it is so is the amount of the money which is given to each entrepreneur. So it's really important how the program is designed. Having a program in place doesn't necessarily provide for success. And I will stop here and thank you so much.
Great, thank you. A lot of work you guys are doing, very exciting things. So to continue this as a conversation, based on the opening remarks or not, is there one question that each of you would like to ask the other panelists, based on what you've heard or what you've read about their work or heard about their work?
May I go first? I would love to.
Please.
No, I would like to talk to Ellen, actually. We are working a lot about, or starting work on the teleworking situation across countries and in regions. And apparently incentives come as part of this discourse. At this point, I think quite a few places are trying just to understand where they are in terms of teleworking, but it's also important to understand how places can benefit from this. And the next step after it is what incentives should be in place. Should it be just, we want to help companies to change their culture and allow their workers to stay home, just trust their employees? Should it be something completely different? At this point, I think there is a lot of, not really confusion, there's just not enough information. And I wanted to ask Ellen how her work, I know she worked on this a little bit, what her understanding of the issue is and how it works in the United States.
That's a great question, and it is a hard one, and it is absolutely evolving as we learn more and we understand how embedded this will or will not be in the way business is done. And it will vary so much by location and region and industry and operations. So, but we have worked on it, and in a few minutes, I'll share a link with a paper that we've done with some partners on this topic. But we've seen it from a couple of different angles. The conversation started last year by states that were wondering how they would monitor compliance with existing incentive agreements, because a lot of those agreements required jobs to be created at a particular place. Well, because of the pandemic and because of even sometimes state laws, that couldn't happen. And so figuring out how and whether to count those jobs became sort of the first thing to figure out. And that's not easy, honestly. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is sort of strategically now, and maybe tactically too, going forward in the next couple of years. Is this going to be a way that companies want to continue to work? And do we have to have a policy? I think, our take right now is you need to have a policy. Your policy can be what you want it to be. You don't have to say, yep, that's all great, or, anything goes at all. But there needs to be a response to when you're interacting with companies that are trying to figure out how to work this way. It's especially difficult because it's not going to be all or nothing. It's probably going to be hybrid, so people might be in the place where you want them, expected them to be some of the time. They're going to be somewhere else part of the time. And where that other place is matters to your expected community benefits from it, your return on investment. Where are they spending their money? How are they interacting with other elements of the supply chain? How are these things changing as it goes on? And what does it mean for you? And that answer, again, is going to be very different if you're in a rural area, if you're in a kind of in between area, if you're in an urban area, if you're in an urban area that crosses state lines and your workers are always crossing states, doesn't matter. I'm in Northern Virginia. Does it matter that the workers that used to be counted in Virginia are now working in the district from their homes or from suburban Maryland? These are hard policy issues to sort out. And again, thinking about what we always say is think about what your objectives are and then work backwards from there. So don't just create an incentive, a remote worker or any incentive policy. Figure out what you're trying to do. And if what you're trying to do, for example, is have more income for state residents, well, then you care a lot that those residents are in your state, and you might value less in your incentive policies those workers in some of the other locations. It might mean something different to you, or it might be different in different communities. Third issue is, at least in the US, a lot of places are talking about incentives for the workers themselves. So they're hoping to attract new remote workers to live and work in their communities. And I think that's a little bit more difficult for a lot of reasons. It's when you start incentivizing people, the existing people don't always love that. It's hard to incentivize and pay enough money to make a difference or to impact a significant number of people, except for the signaling and marketing effect. And again, it can affect the way you measure your return on investment or how you determine the costs and benefits. That's different for people than for companies. And so just kind of doing the math and figuring it all out those are all important steps that need to be taken when you're thinking about this for your economic development and incentives policy.
Great question. Did you have I'm just facilitating the conversation. Do you have any other questions for each other? Because I have a bunch of questions here ready for you guys, but I want to make sure that you're actually discussing it.
I have a question for Zekita, if I may. I think I made notes, but they're inadequate. But I did note that you talked about incentivizing younger workers and businesses to build talent pipelines. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that part of it. You talked about your apprenticeship programs and the way your program works. Mm-hmm. Are there other things that you have in mind that policymakers can do?
So what I think about when I think of incentivizing businesses, one is we talk a lot to companies, larger companies than ourselves, that are first kind of afraid of anything other than hiring entry-level interns or, things of that nature. So when I think about incentivizing, I'm talking about like subsidizing pay for our people, younger people who come in, either as apprentices or interns or an entry level. And then also incentivizing companies, again, with subsidizing pay. If they start programs within the company that will allow for training and then pathways for more education for young people. So with regard to the workers themselves, we think about things like, offering them stipends when they're training. We get questions about that all the time. There's a lack of motivation for the young people that we reach out to and that we train specifically in other organizations like ours. They don't really want to come to training about things that they don't really understand in terms of big picture if there are no incentives with regard to their pay, supportive services, which I heard someone mention when I popped on earlier. Those are things we think about, really practical things. And so it's policy on the state level, but then also within industry, I think needs to be addressed. There's a lot of different moving parts when it comes to building robust pipelines. And if we can come together and figure out ways that the two can work together instead of working in all of these different silos, which are, yes, we have apprenticeship programs at the state level or the federal level, and here's how it works and here's what employers need to do, versus actually working together and there being some sort of synergy between, I pause to say this, but between government and industry, so that they can work together to have a common goal. I think everybody wants the same things. We just go in all these different directions when we're trying to achieve those things.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dr. Tsvetkova, I have a quick question for you. So, follow up on your opening remarks. What are some places, or just one place, for the sake of time, that reformed incentives and made significant changes to how they provided the incentives? And can you communicate any effects for one of these changes that you have through your research or the other work that you're doing?
For this one, I think my research is at the general level, so I cannot really come up with really like really where policy was implemented, changed what it was supposed to change, and we had like really kind of great results. What we see in more general terms, not really looking at the specific policies, how different places are faring over time, and when let's say two different places with regional comparable situations eventually ended up in different growth trajectories. And here I think one of the examples that comes up is Pittsburgh, which was relatively less developed when it was transitioning from the heavy industry. But the presence of the university helped it to really improve its overall standing in terms of growth prospects and how it changed its industrial structure into something that is more competitive in the current environment. We can think about really industrial transitions of places. We can look at Denver, which was quite a disaster at some point. They're still struggling to recover, but it seems that the industrial structure of the place is changing into automotive support activities as opposed to automobile manufacturing. So here I think, again, what is really important for a place to understand what it has and try to really capitalize on it. So it can, sometimes it's hard for a place to really jump over 25 degrees of separation into something completely different, but you can build up incrementally on what you have, take what is strong or what is viable, what has greater growth potential, and then kind of build up on it. We can use the Haussmann proximity, technological proximity, whatever, all this fancy research that picks up a lot of interest here in Europe. But again, it is really boils down to identifying the strength of the place, what it has in terms of human capital, in terms of industrial structure, in terms of technologies, trying to reach out to global pipelines, knowledge pipelines to see how you can benefit. Here again, example probably from outside of United States would be the north of Sweden, where they are pretty rich in terms of resources. So it's technically it makes the economies volatile, and in many cases there is a need to transition away from the resource-dependent economies. What they did, they really were successful in attracting digital technology companies where they do not need to spend a lot of energy actually cooling down their facilities. So Facebook, Amazon, their servers, lots of them are stored in Sweden, in the northern regions, and these regions, if you go into, let's say, now we're looking at productivity, actually it's not Stockholm that comes up in, let's say, IT as the top region in Sweden. It is actually north of the Sweden, like really close to the North Pole. So that would be my response. Yep.
I love it. That's a great response and very helpful. I have a quick follow-up question. I have two more questions. I want one for Ms. Armstrong Asuquo and then Dr. Harpel. So for Ms. Armstrong Asuquo, so you're on the ground as all three of you are. Cash flow problems. How can small businesses access the workforce and employees and recruiting effectively with this in mind? Any quick tip for running out of time?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really great question. And as someone who chairs a nonprofit and runs a small business simultaneously. One thing I know, I can tell you a great resource that I found that I didn't know was there until recently was like AmeriCorps Vistas, right? Which is like these entry-level folks that you can hire. And the reason I focus a lot on sort of entry-level skills clusters to fill pipelines is because new businesses often have a lot of busy work that needs to be done anyway. And so what you really could do is search for, that younger, either recently out of high school that's trainable, or in college that's also trainable, that group of people, and start filling your pipeline so that you probably will have a dedicated workforce, quite honestly. I know that one young person that we brought on has been with us for a while and has intentions on staying, and she's a rock star. We are really focused on cultivating workers rather than what you see typically, which is always running out looking for rock stars and hoping that they're waiting for you to call them up to fill your job slot, right? So I think if small businesses would focus on cultivating talent, look in non-traditional places, work on training skills, and then helping young people who do not have degrees to obtain them, you will find that you will have a more robust pipeline and that you will have more dedicated employees. I can't emphasize that enough because I know that it works. I've seen it work. And I think that we really just all need to, in terms of small business, need to rethink how we're looking for employees and what it means to, when we recruit. I hope that answered your.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Every response is amazing from you three. So thank you. And we've been afforded more time from the executive committee. So this is great. So we don't have to rush too much. We have until 55 past the hour. So Dr. Harpel, please let me know if you have any burning things you wanted to say, because it's, I know you're frequently on YouTube and everything like that, but we have a question about any industries that you think that incentives work particularly well versus others. Or you can, since we only have about 5 more minutes, any burning thing that you want to get across to the audience that you think could be useful?
Good, thank you, and a good question. The incentives, at least the traditional set of incentives, tend to work pretty well for those that are mobile, that can invest capital in a lot of different places. And we know that one of the struggles that a lot of communities face is when they have an existing industry that's part of, or a facility that's part of a bigger operation. And it's frustrating when that company is thinking about making, say, a new investment or an expansion, but what they're legitimately doing is deciding which of their operations is best for that. And so to recognize there's that internal competition for capital from a policy perspective or from an external perspective, it looks like, gosh, here's this company that we thought was great for our community and they're kind of squeezing us, but they're being forced internally to make a justification for that incentive for the cost of that investment. And they want to do everything to actually put that community in the best light within the CFO's office. I just think that's an interesting thing that's often forgotten. So I don't know. I like to raise that. The other thing a burning thing that I always think is very, very important to talk about with incentives is really not just focusing on the incentive box itself, but remembering that incentives are part of the overall economic development effort because they're so high profile. We spend a lot of time talking about them. Since we have them, we really want them to work well. They really do need to be used in the service of a larger objective. And so spending more time asking, what are we trying to accomplish as opposed to exactly what does incentive need to look like that should be the first question, not the second question. What do we want to accomplish? And then how do we use the incentive tool to do that? Not what should our incentive policy look like? That you can't answer that without starting with that first question.
Awesome. So the same thing for Dr. Tsvetkova, and we'll end with Mrs. Armstrong, Asuquo, just the burning thing that you want to get out. I think that all of us have usually one of those things. Just 2 minutes would be amazing for that, please.
Okay, let me just jump on Ellen's presentation and what she said. I think for us, what is really important is the increasing interregional inequalities. I mean, we do see a lot of repercussions of this. And what really would be nice to understand better, and I'm not sure if data at this point is really well suited for this, to understand how incentives can or cannot close the gaps across regions. So it's really, really, really important because eventually, if we need to understand what can be done, it is the incentives. It has to go through incentives or some supports, and who these supports should be targeted to, and how to make sure that we do not have any places left behind. I mean, I think that's the crucial thing to understand and to implement in our policies.
Thank you. And one last word from Mrs. Armstrong, Asuquo, if you would like, and then we'll transition to the next, the roundtable.
I just want to say again, with regard to incentives, I think that all policymakers who are here just really think long and hard about, again, incentivizing our younger potential workforce, incentivizing businesses to create innovative workforce solutions, school districts, because they don't participate in workforce programming that would then lead to post-secondary planning for young people if they're not incentivized. And then also, again, businesses, so that they can open up those entry level, and government should open up more of those entry level slots that, for skills, and then leading into higher education. I can't emphasize enough how important it is. And just back to Ellen's point, thinking about what the big goal is first, and then figuring out the details and of all the incentives later. But if we are going to have a robust economy and stay globally competitive, and again, I'm talking from the US perspective, these are things that we really need to be thinking about. We can't go about business in the same way. It's just not going to work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, this has been amazing. I can't speak for everyone, for the panelists, to say contact them because I'm sure they're busy, but you have a lot of content on YouTube. It was wonderful last few days to learn about your work that way. So now, so thank you so much for the Kauffman Foundation and for agreeing to be on this panel. I'll now transition to the roundtable. It's called Policy Priorities, Entrepreneurship Support, and What's Next for Incentives in the Post-COVID Economy. And the moderator is Miss Melissa Roberts Chapman. She's the Senior Program Officer for Entrepreneurship at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm so pleased to be here. And I think, the last few comments of the previous panelists are a great lead in to the discussion that we're going to be having over the course of the next hour here. As they mentioned, my name is Melissa Roberts Chapman. I lead the Heartland grant-making work here at the Kauffman Foundation. That's really the work that we do in the entrepreneurship department to foster the growth of a world-class innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem in the Heartland region, which we define as Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Iowa. And so we've got a couple of panelists with us today who are issue experts, who are experts on this region. We'll be trying to take this down to a local level as an analog for innovation ecosystems across the country. And so I thought I'd start by offering just a few brief framing comments to talk about why the Heartland is specifically interesting in this context. And then I'll ask the other panelists to introduce themselves and we'll get into the discussion. So I think the first thing to know is that despite our best efforts, the Heartland is middling at best when it comes to producing economic outcomes. That's for a couple of key reasons. The economies of the states in the Heartland are generally considered highly concentrated, so they're reliant on a handful of big employers. Despite this, the employers that we have in this region are, in the greater context, not that big and not that profitable. There's a very few Fortune 500 companies, for instance, in this region as compared with our peer regions. And to add on, the industry mix of the Heartland when it comes to employment right now is not aligned with the occupations that we know will drive growth in a 21st century economy. So with all of that being the case, having smart and intentional economic development strategies that really focus on diversifying our regional economy, on creating the jobs of the future and educating people to be ready to take those jobs or make the jobs themselves by getting into entrepreneurship is really critically important to the future of this region. So with that framing, I'm going to ask each of our three panelists to introduce themselves. And Jeremy, let's start with you.
Hi, Melissa, and hi to the audience. Thank you for having me. As Melissa mentioned, I'm Jeremy Davis. I'm with the Kauffman Foundation. My background is in economic development as a practitioner for several years, working with our local economic development corporation here in Kansas City, and then also been an administrator for workforce development dollars at the state level for the state of Missouri. So now I am with the Kauffman Foundation working in our KC Civic strategy, which kind of intersects education and entrepreneurship to really support efforts around workforce development, family and neighborhood support, and then community asset support. So really happy to be a part of this conversation and some great panelists and conversation up to this point, and really looking forward to having a round table around kind of local and regional economic development. So thank you for having me, Melissa.
Excellent. LaDonna, why don't you take it away next?
Great, thank you. Good morning. My name is LaDonna Gooden. I am a Fuse Fellow in the Mayor's Office working on economic development strategy. I have been in the Midwest about 20 years. I came here working for Sprint. So I have significant long track record in technology, startups, and big data analytics, and have been working the past few years supporting small businesses, particularly with a focus on providing technical assistance to small minority and women-owned businesses to create access and opportunity to different ecosystem. And so I'm really looking forward to having this conversation today.
Excellent. And of course, last but not least, Darrene, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be with each of you today. And I am representing Smart Incentives today. I have Ellen actually presented on the previous webinar hour here. And we've done some recent work on actual incentives, looking at the effectiveness and how it's affecting or possibly not affecting business startups and entrepreneurs. And my work has been in entrepreneurship and economic development over the years, and looking at what are the actual needed impacts and kind of recharging those kind of internal factors from workforce development, and thinking about education and thinking about the capacity of those entrepreneurs on the ground and how to get them connected to the ecosystem. So thank you again for having me join you today.
Excellent. So as we go through this discussion, I'm going to ask a few questions of the panelists, but I'd like to remind everyone in the audience that we'll be opening this discussion up to your Q&A in just a few minutes. So be thinking about the questions you have. Please don't leave us hanging. We're really looking forward to hearing from you and engaging to try and answer some of the questions that we have about the future of this region and the future of economic development together. So my first question is really for you, Darrene. Can we start with really starting to understand the state of the field when it comes to economic development? What do we know about incentives? What do we not know?
Sure. So I am going to focus the comments on the actual in-depth research that we looked at, because part of our work was not just what Ellen presented in the prior and looking to see what works about the incentives that are pushed out there in terms of entrepreneurs and small business programs in general, because we see a lot of those programs are kind of small business legacy programs, but really also trying to think about like the researchers who are doing the work to figure out if incentives work or not. What are the challenges they are being confronted with? And some of the big things that we really took away because of the key challenges facing the design and the evaluation of incentives are really, really tightly wedded to both the making sure the incentives are really matching the program and policy goals, but also thinking about the data and metrics that are needed to figure out what type of possible impacts we're having with those incentives. And so in terms of the policy and the program goals, but we need to really think about design, implementation, administration, data collection, and reporting. All of those must align with the policy and program goals. And what we are finding is that there's kind of three overarching problems. First, there's usually two goals associated with these types of programs. One is kind of what we consider the inside the firm success. Are they growing? What are their sales? What's their profit like? We're not usually tracking those. The second is outside the firm and thinking about like, what's the regional economic benefit? What is the job growth in those communities? And we really found that sometimes when we were trying to think about what the data was being collected on the firm and the actual entrepreneurs' characteristics and the place that those businesses were starting, the data just wasn't there to be able to make really good policy advice and guidance to say, how could we make this incentive work to accomplish the goals that and the outcomes that we are expecting within this investment of money. The second thing was really seeing that, a program like services, entrepreneurial support and services, those were really like, in general, we found some really good positive results of that across the research and across the evaluation research that we looked, but it really was never clear of which services were the best and trying to think about like, where do we get the biggest bang for our buck, if you will. And the other thing that we've heard in earlier sessions is, changing administrations, changing strategies every 4 years, possibly. It really affects the consistency of these types of incentives and these types of programs that are put out there. And we really do know if we're thinking about a startup and trying to really zoom, 5 years from now, we might be able to get a good test of like, what was its growth? What was its impact on the community? But in a year evaluation and 2 years evaluations, we're just not really able to tell it. And I think those are kind of the big takeaways that we found are very problematic and really come away with like trying to give guidance on how do you do a better job at structuring the incentive around your program goals and what type of data do you really need to focus on? And I'm glad to talk about that more if you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have one follow-up question for you before we deep dive with the other panelists. One of the comments that the last panelist made was really talking about the differing experiences of economic growth that we're seeing across the country. There are some regions that are really fostering great innovation ecosystems, and there are some regions that are falling behind. What role do you think incentives play in that conversation in a big picture view, and how should regions think about specializing their incentives to help drive that kind of activity?
I think that one of the issues that we see in this type of Silicon Valley, Route 128 in Massachusetts, or if it's now Austin and maybe other places that have had this type of investment over time, we are all trying to track what was the big change, what was the big, Big Bang theory here of what created these types of regional changes. And we're not able to do a good job at that on the research side because a lot of the data is just not there, or we're kind of just assuming that we know what the secret sauce was. And so I think that one of the things when we're trying to structure incentives is to think about what are the big gaps in our area that we're trying to fill, and really understanding what are the challenges and the disparities. A lot of these programs are out there and we just assume, hey, we're getting pretty good take up, we're getting some growth here, we're accounting to that. It seems like we're on the right track. However, if we start to disaggregate that data and look at within like what types of firms or what type of sectors or businesses of people of color, what we've learned from COVID, right? That the ideas that they were more impacted because of the challenges, maybe it was language, maybe they were unbanked, and so they weren't able to participate. Maybe there was, if they were undocumented types of entrepreneurs, they were actually not going to apply for any types of government loans and these types of possible help. And so, in the same thing with incentives, if we're going to design and structure to try to think about like what our area's biggest challenges are, we need to do a better job at understanding what our area's biggest challenges are, and just not take an incentive that's working very well in the Silicon Valley and plop it down in Omaha, Nebraska.
I think that's a great point. So as we get deeper into the details of this region, Jeremy, let's turn to you. Based on your career kind of as an economic development practitioner, would love to hear from you, what's the strength of the system that we have right now? What do these incentives do a good job of supporting? And just generally, how did you think about this as a practitioner of choosing? And how did you think about, which projects were successful or what a failure state looked like?
Yeah, no, great question. Happy to dive into it. My experience as a kind of a feet on the ground administrator of incentives here for the region is really that we, as a community, tend to look at the building case versus the business case for incentives. And what I mean by that is kind of what's the immediate impact. A lot of incentives, especially locally, tend to lend itself towards building of a new facility or rehabilitation and that sort of thing. And we've been able to do it pretty well here, regionally. And that really has contributed to, I think, kind of an anecdotal increase in quality of life and things like that. So I'm just thinking of kind of the rehabilitation of our downtown area and the areas proximate to it, all that sort of thing, where, several hundreds of millions of dollars have been invested publicly and privately, incentives and that sort of thing. But it really has kind of helped to stabilize and kind of accelerate that area of our community. So I think incentives have a major role in playing that sort of a partnership role in economic development. I'm really kind of catalyzing real estate in areas where maybe there wasn't much of a market before, or there was really a need for public subsidy in order for it to catalyze and bring in further development. And I think, that sort of thing is good. Tackling historic renovation or brownfield development, things like that, to where we always talk about the but-for and the gap analysis when it comes to economic development, whether it's attached to people and workforce development or attached to real estate. We're talking about that gap and the need to address some of those issues. So I think economic development does a good job there, and I think that's where it was originally intended to address some of those issues. But I think looking past that is kind of where economic developers struggle. So past the building and what's brand new or what makes kind of immediate sense to incentivize as far as a new building or whatever that effort may be. How do we look at, as Darrene was mentioning, how do we look at the business case and really say, okay, we built a new building, we maybe attracted a new company to come in, but really how is that company really contributing to the well-being of the region overall? Are they paying competitive wages? Are they really putting workforce development as a top priority? Are they moving the needle for some of those high-level economic development indicators past just signing a lease and occupying space, that sort of thing? So kind of really taking a look at those long-term indicators, I think is kind of a struggle and something that we can kind of gear our efforts towards and really focus in on. But as far as kind of the immediate need for incentives to catalyze some of those real estate deals and push things forward to where, in instance, a redevelopment maybe never would occur because of some challenges. I think we do a good job there. But how do we get past that and look past that at the bigger picture is the challenge, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I think that's a great summary. And Jeremy, just while we're on you, can you give the folks who maybe are not as familiar with the redevelopment story of downtown Kansas City a sense of the role that incentives played in that conversation and the conversation that we're having about them today? And then we'll turn to LaDonna, who's right in the middle of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Be happy to do it. So our redevelopment efforts in Kansas City really started, I guess about 20 years ago now at the turn of the century, and really kind of focusing in on our downtown area that really become desolate, abandoned throughout the years because of a number of issues, and was really in need of some attention and some reinvestment. So, the city was a major player in doing that, kind of a long-term downtown redevelopment plan, and really mobilizing city resources to take the lead on securing land and then to catalyze a redevelopment of our downtown area. So we started with the entertainment district and an entertainment venue, arena that the city took the lead on redeveloping, and then some housing as well. But then shortly thereafter, around 2005, we started seeing private dollars come in to support housing and support some of the activity that's been going on downtown. But it took that public vision and investment in order to catalyze that. And then a lot of time, still even today, it takes that public partnership to still get deals done, but there's more of a market, much more of a market downtown for that private investment to come in, whether it's incentivized or not. So, but like I said, that initial investment by the city and public players was really the catalyst to make that happen. And you see that throughout many major cities in America, where it takes that private investment to do it. And we're starting to do the same thing in our region around our riverfront development, right, proximate to downtown as well. So yeah, no, I'll be able to kick it over. Like I said, LaDonna is right in the thick of things now from the city's perspective, and I'm sure she'd have more insight about it.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue to turn to LaDonna. LaDonna, my question for you making this transition is, tell us about the current state of the incentive debate in Kansas City on a local level.
Sure. This last year has really been marked by a lot of conversation about incentive reform here in Kansas City. It really came to a fever pitch on the heels of what happened with George Floyd. I think what we saw in Kansas City was really an indication, I think, of what happens in a lot of major cities, but the timing is everything. And so what we saw in this past year, where we've had a significant investment in our downtown, like so many cities across the nation have had to have that resurgence. What we saw with in the spring and summer was we were hearing feedback that we were left out, many people were left out of the economy. Not only were the new housing and the new playground that was created not accessible to all segments of the population, the growth opportunities were relegated to larger businesses, a certain demographic. And so you saw a great disparity in development, in access to capital across the city. And then this debate about how this ties to education. So the ability of our mental health organizations, as well as our public schools, to be able to service the community. And so in Kansas City, we have the city, and then we have taxing jurisdictions. And I'm not certain that that's the same in every community around the country. But in many respects, we're so incredibly fragmented. Not only do we have those taxing jurisdictions, we have 14 school districts within our borders. We are part of 4 counties. We have multiple institutions. And so getting everyone aligned about what the North Star has been incredibly challenging. And so I think as we think about economic incentive reform and just economic development policy, I think there are two themes that come to mind. Is this notion of growth that we've been talking about in quite a lot of detail, and then that is equity. How do we include other members of the community?
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to dive deeper and speak a little bit more specifically. I think you brought up a great point, which is that when we offer tax incentives, a lot of time we talk about the incentives, but those tax dollars are coming from somewhere. There's something else that's maybe being under-resourced as a result. So, in your opinion and in your experience, who is missing from the conversation around incentives and around what that true north looks like? And what needs are these incentives maybe failing to serve as a result?
Right. Well, I like the first comment, which is about data, and that's my background as well, having worked in consumer research and data analytics for a very long time. What we do and what we do well, I don't know that we have a good understanding of that first and foremost. And I think that is certainly a starting point, because I think if you're going to have a strategy, you need to be able to measure what you value. And I don't know that we have good success or KPIs as they exist today. When we think about incentives, and they're really a lot of the tools that we have at our disposal are really about tax redirection or reassigning earnings, tax and income, because we have an earnings tax here in Kansas City because of our bi-state location. There are certain things that get involved in this conversation. So our school districts have been broken apart. And so each of those is associated with property taxes. And so when a corporation or, looks to relocate, what those dollars come out of our mental health funds are the whatever school district that we happen to be in. And because of the way of the school districts are aligned, our inner city, what you were seeing is the fever pitch around our inner city schools, our Black and brown communities, were the disproportionate number of the projects were happening. I felt that they were being targeted or not receiving their fair level of respect versus other parts of the community. So we still have, the remnants of, a history of redlining and policy that promoted suburban growth versus inner city growth. And so I think those are some of the conversations that we probably need to get grounded on as we discuss what equity is. I think we're all, in many respects, we are starting from different points of view about what equity means.
I think that's a great observation. I have a few other questions for the panelists, but I'm going to take a moment and turn to an audience question. Before I do that, quick reminder, I see a number of folks from around the Heartland in the chat, and so I would love to hear from you and would love to hear your questions for these experts. Beth Johnson, Chris Jackson, I'm looking at you. And real quick, I'm going to go to a question from Janae Talbot, who's very active in central and western Kansas. She asked, do you see any indicators that point to the potential for rural growth in building innovation and entrepreneurial efforts such that they might spur growth from within and also attract projects? Is there a way that these work together, and what might be special or different about incentives in rural communities?
Billy, first, you mentioned the fact that you have a variety of small business loans, and they're great, but they're not enough. And I would kind of question a little bit to see, like, they're great because you have kind of the standard kind of metrics, like there's 20 taken out a year for this amount. Are they just kind of more program type of like reporting metrics? Or are we actually seeing that they're filling the gap? And I would say, like, with the types of businesses and the types of entrepreneurs that you are kind of trying to focus on because you think there's opportunity in your community for this type of business to really thrive, what are the gaps that those types of businesses, those type of entrepreneurs would really be faced in a credit market, right? And so when we're thinking about the small business loans, they can be really actually targeted much better with good management practices and thinking about kind of the sustained outreach that is really effective and getting to those individuals. And so this might be like a really different type of business loan program, because you're really trying to like be maybe a little bit too niche, but you actually are doing the outreach that makes that niche really attractive to the types of businesses that you're looking to charge up in your community. The second thing I would say is like on the services side, I think that when we're thinking about building innovation and entrepreneurial efforts in rural areas or any type of areas, the types of services that those businesses need, they're not going to be all the same, right? It might just be some business financial literacy, like, understanding, how to grow a business, like having better connections to the workforce and actually employee training and employee, like, how do I hire? How do I keep employees happy? How, the previous session we heard kind of the comment about like looking for rock stars for some of these entrepreneurs that are trying to grow might be really difficult for them. It's maybe especially in certain types of areas, like rural areas, where we do know that sometimes there's been the brain drain and a lot of your younger youth are going maybe and not coming back. But how do you kind of like get the high schooler or get the types of people that are underemployed and come in to really add to the business? So thinking about services that are much more about like the basics of business sometimes can be very important, and the basics of growing a business. And it's not just about venture capital. Again, these are if we're trying to focus on these high tech oriented and growth oriented entrepreneurs, we would try to customize our services very differently. So understanding what your targets are and what's actually a legitimate target and what the possibilities are in your community is going to be very important. From your business loans, from your type of business services, and even your workforce development in terms of how you're kind of really working with your workforce development groups. We time and time again in economic development and workforce development, we're always pointing fingers at each other saying, we don't talk to each other. Why is that? I mean, supposedly we have incentives, the industry is at the table, we have all these best practices, but something is still disconnected. And so in an area that could maybe really wrestle in those stakeholders to the table and say, this is our challenge, this is what the type of businesses we need, this is the type of credit access problems we're seeing, these are the types of business kind of literacy types of struggles we're seeing, and this is type of the workforce. What's the package we could put together? And actually think about this in a creative way, and then really think about the private investment, as Jeremy was talking about. Who would come to the table to really sponsor maybe some apprenticeships or some other types of ways to get more charge into your efforts?
I think that's a great segue into my next question. And this is something I'm developing on the fly, so I have to apologize to the panelists for not sending it out in advance, but I'm pretty sure you'll have some thoughts on this point. So one of the phrases that comes to mind from the business world that I think is kind of relevant in the world of economic development incentives today is you have to spend money to make money. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of economic development incentives that are organized around, the presence of a tax burden, for instance, which we know is unlikely to be something that is useful to, say, startup businesses that don't earn money, that don't earn a profit in the first few years of business, or maybe communities that experience generational wealth divides. For instance, we know that the average wealth of a Black family in this country is 10% that of the average, net worth of a white family in this country per the Brookings Institution's research. How do you think about communities where you can't invest, you don't have money, you can't use that as a basis to make money, and how do we think about economic development incentives and expenditures in a different way? How do we frame this conversation differently to make sure that we're not starting at the place where people have to have money to make money?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at some just observations and thoughts from the last year. I think what you see in Kansas City is certainly a great wealth divide, and it's certainly very much segmented by a Troost, a significant street down the middle of the city, and so I think you hit on something which is home ownership. And our economic development tools are very blunt instruments, I would say. And so what I would like to add to this conversation and thought process is that this is, in fact, it has to be a collaboration with our business communities and our philanthropic communities. It is not, the incentives in themselves will not do it all, particularly when we're talking about commitment to engaging with different parts of the community. Home ownership. So, and your research has shown, and I believe the Fed has shown, women of color, Latinx, we're seeing a lot of growth. These are entrepreneurs out of necessity. They, because they have been left out or left behind in the workforce. And increasingly they use their savings to enable their business to launch or start. And so home ownership as an access to creates access to capital in many respects. And so, you know, if we think about the entire ecosystem and all the tools that we have, is creating opportunity for more home ownership among a more diverse group of individuals, in fact, a means to create capital. So the government, are we good at picking winners and losers? Perhaps not, but are we, if we enable home ownership, which helps with crime, it helps with neighborhood stabilization, it helps with repopulation, which ultimately creates revenue, does that create the opportunity for a more inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystem with, you know, home ownership? And then, you know, thinking about wraparound services, so that ecosystem, I think you spoke a little bit about technical assistance and availability. There's a lot of funding that's directed towards startups, and the vast majority of businesses fail at some point. And so how do you enable those businesses to continue to grow? And so thinking back in our incentive toolbox, you know, what we do have is with large corporations, which, you know, no one ever was wrong when they bet on McKinsey or IBM, right? So the risk averse entities, you know, do we have the ability to incentivize kind of mixed use constructions where spaces are provided to entrepreneurs? And do we have the ability to leverage things like community benefits and change the dialogue with where's an expectation that you are going to be helping provide support for entrepreneurs in our community, entrepreneurs of color, and the emerging workforce by partnerships with our schools and our universities and our community colleges. And so I think about that in terms of perhaps a slightly different use of the incentive tools just beyond the tax abatements themselves.
I agree. Yeah, I think LaDonna summed it up very well there. But yeah, just the support of families and neighborhoods and financial literacy and education, all that sort of thing, I think goes into it to help position community and those who are aspiring to start a business, position them in the best way to be prepared to do that. And like it is, LaDonna said, to gain appreciable assets, housing and other means to where they can have some capital to put towards it, supplementing that from a community standpoint with services and coaching on how to start a business and resources to tap into it. So I think all those things are important, and they're not, you know, traditional incentives, but it's really about support and providing resources to help support the entrepreneurial ecosystem in the community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone else have anything to add?
Just one thing on that. I think that what we're talking about kind of is this approach that is just much more of a collective of the powers that exist in these types of areas we're talking about. And one of the things in recent work that I did in Sacramento, for example, we led this, it was called Project Prosper, and led it to their economic, you know, action agenda, if you will. And one of the things that was really essential is that there was leadership that came in and the mayor that said, you know, I don't like the way that things are so disconnected between neighborhood development, community development, economic development, and community engagement. It seems like everybody's going their opposite way. And so the work that we really did was trying to say, like, how do we make investments as the city is going to make about kind of these neighborhoods kind of as a collective? And so some of them are a little bit better off. They're going to need different types of investment and different capacity. But in these neighborhoods or these challenged corridors, which is what they ended up focusing on, we really thought about like bringing in these neighborhood action teams that had community economic development, community engagement, and they had like investment coming through different types of the monies they were already spending in these different pots come together. And so it wasn't talking about additional monies. It was actually just saying, hey, you know, we're not doing a good job at figuring out what the investment should be and what's the real need. And so it came with community assessment. It came with a lot more community input and actually kind of thinking about all these. We had a number of minority and ethnic chambers. We had a number of community-based organizations who are all doing this on their own. But when all the money kind of started to come through and say, we're going to actually leverage this and help that, and it just became a different conversation. And I do think that, yes, we're spending money, but we're spending the same money in a different way. And I think that there are some creative ways that we can think about those type of investments.
I think that's an excellent point. And I would just add, I think in these earlier conversations, panel, we talked about, are we investing in high growth businesses or services businesses that, create stability and opportunities as well. And, I'd like to think about it as a portfolio just from, my business days of, kind of what are your cash cows, the things that are going to be there forever, and then what create those kind of long tail, but, maybe more speculative. And so I think it's really challenging to pick winners and losers in that kind of environment. So I do think there's some practicality in looking at, as a practitioner, some like low-hanging fruit, meaning, for among those, each person that I get employed increases my GDP. It contributes to the GDP of the city and of the region. And so, as as a metric and as a measure of outcome, that is certainly one to keep, that one can keep an eye on. And so there are a lot of informal businesses. And then the last year, what we found is when we removed barriers such as penalties and fines, we had businesses that were in the informal economy become part of the formal economy. And then I've seen in cities like Santa Fe, where there's also an additional amount of incentive, and it's small, but it enables businesses to go from the home to an actual location. So it's a grant. So to continue to support at different stages of growth. And in those ways, it may be practical because you have the opportunity to do small amounts to a large number of businesses, but then really that increases the likelihood that, the 10% or 2% or 3% that will succeed, you've fostered that. And so, there may be some opportunity there as well.
Absolutely. So building on that, I've got a question from the audience. And LaDonna, you already started to answer this question, but maybe you've got some additional thoughts. What have you seen work in terms of building champions for supporting entrepreneurs and growing businesses outside of your organization? So how have you kind of engaged with those champions and influencers in the community to help move this new philosophy forward?
Right. And I think that's a great question. And I think this is a long story, right? I think we had a flashpoint last year, and I believe we are all coming to an understanding of what our policies have historically done and are coming to terms with the outcomes. And so as we've engaged with corporations, I think really the strength comes from, some our homegrown entities and some of our, larger entities who understand that, diverse, Generation Z is already majority minority, that women are $20 trillion in buying power, African Americans are $3 trillion in buying power. I mean, not having an inclusive workforce already dampens your prospects from a business. And so we've seen that with McKinsey studies along the line. And so there are certain entities and certain corporations that have embraced that. And so what we've seen is kind of a rebound effect to downtown by some businesses that want to be closer in proximity to a Latinx community who have needs that have a global service need and want to see this. So I think part of this conversation is about identifying those cheerleaders that are already seeing the business imperative, and I think focusing it to the bottom line, and then having that be the message that they can evangelize in the larger community. Because I think, until, for many, it has to be a business case. It doesn't, feel good does not necessarily, as long as my needs are met, I'm not sure how, well engaged I want to be. So I think it's trying to find those partners that are looking, that understand that in our city, a strong Kansas City means a strong region. So we need to, increase the GDP of our workforce here.
Great. I think I might broaden that question a little bit and ask, in a larger sense, what examples can we look to around the country, from each of you who are doing this work every day, that can show us what it looks like to really implement a new economic development philosophy that is more entrepreneurial, that is more inclusive? What have you seen from around the country and around the world that we can learn from?
I can start. The recent work that Ellen and I did for the Pew Charitable Trusts, they commissioned a report for us to take a look at equitable economic development and inclusive growth initiatives that were, they wanted to understand what was going on in terms of trying to think of also like equitable community engagement and how can community really be part of the process, and not just the economic development saying, we have a project, we want to do that here. How do you all feel about it, right? And then this kind of public meeting process. And so one of the things is we took a deep dive and trying to we looked at probably around 50 cities in terms of those who were talking about economic development in a different way, and trying to not just possibly put a label on it saying, hey, we're equitable or we're inclusive. And the four that we did a deep dive into, I would call out, is Fresno. They have a actual economic, it ends up being kind of the comprehensive economic development strategy that they'll put to the EDA, but it's being led by the actual Community Valley the Central Valley Community Foundation. And it does have the previous mayor of Fresno, who is now their CEO, so that there is the connection to the city. But the city and the county are they're kind of on the outside, and it's about driving inclusive growth. And they are working with both sides of the table, they would say, but actually it's much more collaborative than that. There was race and equity is very much embedded in their approach, and they are trying to just have as much input from the community-based organizations and the social type of service delivery and intermediaries in the area as they are from the Fresno Business Council or the Workforce Development Board. We looked at Portland, and their Prosper Portland has a number of neighborhood programs that they're trying to do more about neighborhood inclusive growth, and have a set of actually programs that are and services that are connected to help entrepreneurs of color and those struggling to get into the market, and that they are developing their own shared metrics about what does it mean to deal more directly with the disparities and the problems that those businesses are facing in the market. We looked at also Atlanta's economic mobility study and trying to think about, or strategy, and trying to think about how are they trying to address the south side of Atlanta in a very different way than has previously been done. And a lot of that type of work came from a Bloomberg foundation type of support. So that, again, we were talking about the money that's not there. How do we possibly attract it? I think that these are lessons that possibly are important. And the other is actually an interesting one that Ellen took a much deeper dive on and looked at Upper Cumberland, Tennessee, and trying to think about how they're looking at the opioid crisis as a workforce challenge, and really thinking about, like, if we don't do this in a more collective economic workforce way that's much more open and inclusive and understanding what that challenge means, what do we expect to happen to people's lives, jobs quality in that area, and even the future of actual economy and business ability in that area. So those are kind of 4 deep dives, and I can gladly share that research and the link there in the chat. But I think that what we're really trying to target down is these strategies are really important in terms of thinking about who's not been at the table before, and have them at the table to try to think about what those problems are, and then realize that the creativity that can be there at the table. I know it sounds kind of like miraculous maybe, and I just puff something onto the table, but it does come to a different conversation, and really realizing the historical inequities and disadvantages that certain population has had and have not benefited from the incentives that we thought were really doing pretty well is very evident and very much a part of the conversation going forward. And I think that's an essential lesson.
Absolutely. Jeremy, LaDonna, any other thoughts on things you see working around the country, things that you look to as an example?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I appreciate those examples because those are so many of the cities that I look to. And, you know, Fresno was really the one that quantified this notion of how much GDP per work, you know, really that metric and thinking about that. You know, one of the things that when I talk about land, home ownership and so forth, because Kansas City has a strong construction and design, architectural design, those are some key strengths in our city, in our region. You know, and so looking at cities like Indianapolis, where, you know, strategies of industry clusters, and I think that's not just in that city, that's in multiple places, but what are we good at already? And then what can we use to facilitate and spur off additional entrepreneurs and additional related services. So I think that works. I think the additional aspect I would add for Portland, which is this notion, and I love their strategy of Prosper Portland, which was we help diverse companies diversify if they so choose, and we help diverse companies grow. And, you know, so they really kind of incorporated it and made it very aspirational and part of it. So all the incentives, every tool is available to those companies that are truly committed to diverse growth. And we understand that that typically has a higher economic impact, a positive economic impact in the long term. So.
Yeah, and I'll say for me, just looking at from a philanthropic standpoint, what some other organizations are doing. Like I've connected with some folks up in Michigan and at the Kellogg Foundation and what they're doing, and just in the way of inclusive prosperity throughout the state, and looking at particularly like in Grand Rapids, how they coordinate very well with workforce investment boards, and kind of looking at as a continuum on how to really support education of all kinds, including entrepreneurship education and everything, and support for the various communities and cities in Michigan. So trying to learn from that. Then the other thing is just, you know, in Kansas City, one thing that we really got to focus on as an economic development tool is, and this kind of is, again, looking past incentives and stuff, but just community development and getting our arms around neighborhood empowerment, crime prevention, all that sort of stuff. I talk about it all the time that, you know, we shouldn't be mentioned from a standpoint of being, having aspirations of becoming, you know, one of the most entrepreneurial cities in the nation, but then we have a big issue with crime as well, and urban renewal and revitalization. So looking at communities like Omaha, Nebraska, where they have a 360 empowerment network, and really looking at the indicators of crime and public health, and how do you address those sort of issues so that all communities, all districts, all neighborhoods are positioned to take advantage of regional economic growth. You know, how do we make it to where there's not the winners and losers, and, you know, not just the downtown and affluent areas receive incentives and support, but how do you stabilize and secure neighborhoods and position them to receive some of that increase in economic activity as well. So taking a look at how to provide kind of, you know, feet on the street, neighborhood level support and programming to neighborhoods, so that way we can make sure that development goes there, and looking at it through an equity lens. How do you make sure that our Black and brown communities, again, are positioned and not continuously overlooked when it comes to traditional economic incentives and then new incentives that we're trying to implement? How do we make sure that all citizens are positioned to do it? So taking a look at how we bring a model like that to Kansas City to kind of really target neighborhood level programming, support, and everything from education, workforce development, housing support, all that sort of thing, and kind of really targeting and take a look at neighborhoods and improve neighborhoods that need it the most.
Great. I think I want to get this last audience question in before I ask the final question. So I might ask folks who feel well equipped to answer it to be pretty brief. But Beth Johnson asked a great question about kind of how do we reconcile short-term benefits or short-term incentives that elected officials have with the longer-term return of investing in entrepreneurship and building a more inclusive economy. How do you convince people who might need that short-term return to win an election, for instance, to focus on the long tail benefits? Anybody have some thoughts on that question?
Well, I would just add at this point, COVID has created a short-term need, right? Part of so much of our recovery is really dependent upon the rebound of our small business community, and because of the way we work and the decisions made by corporations, I think there is probably this is a crisis that has a potential upside. So as we think about the CARES funding and how we might leverage that, to our benefit, I think that this is a moment where many communities have the opportunity to influence and talk about smaller scale businesses as opposed to the larger businesses.
And tagging on that, the ARP, I've heard ARPA, but I don't want to call it ARPA because ARPA is different. But anyway, the whole American Rescue Plan, right? When they're having quite a bit of money coming down to state and locals. I mean, even the city of Lafayette, California, in the East Bay area is going to get, $5 million, and they don't know what to do with it. And they're actually asking for advice from different types of, consultants to different types of boards in the area. What's the biggest need? So we need to figure out a way, how do we actually structure that money in a lot more targeted way and really figure out what are those needs and those disparities. I would say kind of some big kind of points as far as trying to get this short-term type of incentivized individual onto the long-term train would be that really thinking about you're making investments today that are not just generating, impacts today. Your service deliveries today have impact on what happens 5 years from now and 10 years from now. And wouldn't you like that to actually contribute to a bigger, different type of economy? Why don't we grow it back better than what we were and more resilient than what we were? And so trying to have that conversation, it is an education conversation, but it is, I think, at a legitimate point that often short-term focus doesn't necessarily give a lot of weight to. And thinking about a lot of these communities, they should diversify. They need to diversify. If COVID didn't show them that, and economic shocks that will continue to happen because of these types of possible variants and other types of natural disasters and emergencies that we face regularly, diversification of the economy and trying to support small businesses to get technical assistance to be online and have an online presence, enjoying the e-commerce world. How do our services survive? We're a service economy now. How do our services actually survive in these types of shutdown or prolonged type of not with your customer on a regular basis? And thinking about really the role of policy guidance. And so thinking about the policy guidance that is about investments in the long term or short term or long term, and that the diversification of the economy is essential.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for deep and wide-ranging discussion of kind of a new philosophy of economic development. I want to thank each of you, as well as all of the folks who have participated in the discussion as attendees, for joining us. Before I turn it over to the Kauffman team, just one summarizing statement. It sounds like these economic incentives, they're a statement of what we value in society, and our values are changing. And so these packages and how we think about economic growth and the economic development of our communities has got to change with it. So thank you so much. And Jessica, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you to all of our panelists today who shared their knowledge and insights with us. And thank you so much also to our audience who raised so many important questions. We appreciate all of you being here today. I'd like to invite you all to next month's forum, which is planned for Thursday, April 29th. Our topic will be entrepreneurship and COVID-19 reflections on the past year. In the forum, we will highlight trends emerging from recent data on entrepreneurship and insights gathered from working with entrepreneurs and communities And we'll also be discussing how the landscape is changing for entrepreneurs in the US and what this means for policy and entrepreneurship support organizations in the months and years ahead. The conversation will begin here at 9 a.m. Central on Thursday, April 29th. The registration link will be shared in the chat. I look forward to seeing you all again next month. Until then, be well, and thank you again for joining us today.